Welcome, beautiful souls, to Her Journey, the channel where we dive deep into the raw, powerful stories of women who defied the odds, found their strength, and delivered a dose of unforgettable justice. Today, we're talking about a betrayal so profound, it struck at the very core of trust and family. Imagine living in a world of silence for years, only for a miracle to restore your hearing. But what if that miracle became a secret, a hidden superpower that allowed you to hear the darkest truths about those you loved most? And what if those truths were so shocking, they ignited a firestorm of revenge, leading to a reckoning no one saw coming? Get ready, because this is a journey of triumph you won't want to miss. They say grief changes you. For me, it didn't just change me. It stripped me bare, then rebuilt me, stronger, sharper, and with a purpose I never knew I had. My name is Martha Goretti, and my husband, Thomas, was my world. When he died, I thought my life was over. But it was just beginning. It began the moment I regained my hearing after years of silence. And thank God I didn't tell my family immediately. The very day I heard, it left me in shock. They thought my silence was weakness, a convenient cloak for their greed. They had no idea I was listening, learning, and pulling the strings of their own destruction right under their arrogant noses. This is my journey. This is her journey. And trust me, you'll want to see how this one ends. 5 years. That's how long I lived in a world wrapped in cotton, where sound was nothing more than a distant memory. It started with a sudden illness, a rare neurological condition that stripped away my hearing overnight. One morning I woke up to Thomas calling my name from the kitchen, and by evening, I couldn't hear my own voice when I tried to call back. Those first months were the hardest. The isolation was suffocating. I'd sit in my garden, watching the birds I knew were singing, seeing the leaves rustle in what I could only assume was wind. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was prison bars made of nothingness, trapping me in my own mind. Thomas was my anchor during those dark days. He learned sign language faster than I did, his weathered hands spelling out love letters in the air between us. He'd sit with me for hours, just holding my hand, his presence filling the void where sound used to live. When he died suddenly of a heart attack 3 years into my deafness, I thought the silence would swallow me whole. My son Kyle and his wife Kiva were supportive at first. They'd come by twice a week, Kyle awkwardly signing basic phrases while Kiva smiled tightly, her impatience barely concealed behind polite concern. But as months turned to years, their visits became obligations, their smiles strained performances. I learned to read their lips, to watch their body language, to exist in their world of sound by observing every flicker of expression. What I didn't realize was that I was becoming invisible to them. They'd talk around me, over me, sometimes even about me, assuming my deafness made me less present, less aware, less human. The loneliness was crushing, but I found an unexpected strength in observation. Without the distraction of sound, I became a student of human behavior. I watched how Kyle's shoulders tensed when he looked at our family photos, how Kiva's eyes would dart to the expensive artwork on my walls, how they'd exchange glances when they thought I wasn't looking. Then came the miracle. Dr. Sarah Chun was young, brilliant, and convinced that my condition might be reversible with a revolutionary new treatment. The procedure was experimental, a combination of regenerative therapy and advanced cochlear implants that could potentially restore near-normal hearing. I had nothing to lose and everything to gain. The surgery was on a Tuesday. I remember that because Thomas had always loved Tuesdays, he said they were full of possibility, unmarked by the weight of Monday's dread or Wednesday's hump day desperation. As I went under anesthesia, I whispered a prayer to whatever force governs second chances. I woke up to nothing. The same cotton-wrapped silence I'd known for 5 years. Dr. Chen assured me this was normal, that my brain needed time to adjust, that the implants required weeks to fully integrate. I went home disappointed, but not defeated. Then, on a Thursday morning exactly 3 weeks later, I heard it. A bird. A single, crystal-clear note floating through my bedroom window. I sat up so fast, I nearly fell out of bed, my heart pounding with a rhythm I could suddenly hear thundering in my ears. The world exploded into sound. The hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway, the distant rumble of traffic, the whisper of wind through leaves. It was overwhelming and beautiful and terrifying all at once. I sat on my bed and cried, not just from joy, but from the sheer intensity of being thrust back into a world I'd forgotten was so loud. My first instinct was to call Kyle immediately. I reached for my phone, fingers trembling with excitement, ready to share this miraculous news. But something stopped me. A feeling I couldn't quite name, a whisper of intuition that said, "Wait." Maybe it was the way Kyle had seemed so comfortable with my disability lately, how he'd stopped trying to sign, and just spoke at me instead of to me. Maybe it was how Kiva had started referring to me as poor Martha in conversations I could lip read but wasn't supposed to understand. Maybe it was the way they'd both relaxed into treating me like a piece of furniture in my own home. Instead of calling, I sat in my kitchen and listened. Really listened. To the sounds of my house, to the neighborhood, to the world I'd been missing. And I made a decision that would change everything. I would keep my hearing a secret at least for a little while. I would perfect the act of deafness, learn to navigate this new reality quietly, and see what the world looked like when people thought I couldn't hear them. It was the best decision I ever made. The first few days of secret hearing were like learning to walk again. I had to remember not to react to sudden noises, to keep my face blank when someone spoke behind me, to maintain the careful choreography of deafness I'd perfected over 5 years. I practiced in my bathroom mirror, watching my expressions, making sure I looked appropriately vacant when sounds occurred outside my awareness. Kyle and Kiva came for their usual Sunday visit that first week. I sat in my living room chair, the same one I'd occupied for countless silent conversations, and watched them settle into their routine. Kyle kissed my cheek perfunctorily, his cologne too strong, while Kiva perched on the edge of the couch like she might flee at any moment. "How are you feeling, Mom?" Kyle asked, his hands moving through the basic signs he'd learned years ago. But I could hear the words too, and something in his tone made me pay attention. There was an edge there, an impatience that his signing couldn't convey. I nodded and smiled, giving my usual response. But now I could hear Kiva's sharp intake of breath, the way she muttered under her breath, "This is ridiculous, Kyle. She's never going to get better." My blood chilled, but I kept my face neutral. They thought I couldn't hear them. They thought I was trapped in my silent world forever. And somehow, that seemed to be exactly what they wanted. For the next hour, I listened to fragments of conversation they clearly believed I couldn't access. Kiva complained about the inconvenience of visiting. Kyle mentioned something about plans and timelines. They spoke in the casual, careless way people do when they believe they're unobserved. But it was the following Wednesday that my world truly shattered. Kyle had come alone, claiming Kiva had a headache. He'd been more agitated than usual, pacing around my living room, checking his phone constantly. I pretended to read a magazine while actually watching him carefully, noting every fidget, every nervous gesture. Then his phone rang. "Marcus?" he answered, and I could hear both sides of the conversation clearly. "Yeah, I'm at my mother's place now. She can't hear anything, don't worry." My magazine trembled in my hands, but I forced myself to keep staring at the same page about garden roses I'd been pretending to read. "Look, I know it's been 7 years, but we need to talk about the Patterson situation again," Kyle continued, his voice dropping to what he thought was a whisper. "The wife is asking questions. She hired a private investigator." Patterson. My heart stopped. I knew that name. Frank Patterson had been Thomas's business partner for over a decade. A gentle man with a kind smile and a brilliant mind for investments. He'd been Thomas's closest friend, the best man at our wedding, the godfather Kyle had ignored for most of his adult life. Frank had died by suicide 7 years ago, jumping from his office building after his investment firm collapsed in what appeared to be a massive fraud scandal. Thomas had been devastated. He'd spent months trying to clear Frank's name, insisting that his friend would never have stolen from clients, that someone else had to be responsible. But the evidence was damning, and Frank was dead, unable to defend himself. Thomas had grieved not just for his friend, but for the tarnished legacy Frank had left behind. Now Kyle was on the phone, discussing Frank Patterson like he was a problem to be managed, not a dead man who deserved justice. "The documents are buried deep," Kyle was saying. "We made sure of that. But if she keeps digging, Marcus, you know what we did. The transfers, the false signatures, the way we made it look like Frank was the one stealing when it was really—" He stopped abruptly, and I realized I had gasped audibly. But Kyle was looking at his phone, not at me. "You're breaking up," he said. "Look, I'll call you back when I get home. Mom's just sitting here reading. She can't hear anything anyway. We'll figure this out." He hung up and looked at me with what I now recognized as calculated concern.
"Sorry, Mom."
"Work call. You know how it is." I nodded vaguely, but inside, my world was crumbling. My son, my only child, the boy I'd raised to be honorable and kind, was a murderer. Maybe not with his own hands, but he'd killed Frank Patterson as surely as if he'd pushed him from that building himself. The pieces fell into place with horrifying clarity. Frank's investment firm had been managing Thomas's retirement accounts. Kyle had been working there as a junior partner, learning the business, supposedly preparing to take over the family finances someday. The fraud had been discovered just months before Frank's death, and Kyle had been the one to discover the discrepancies, the one to present the evidence that made Frank look guilty. But Frank hadn't been guilty.
Kyle had been.
Kyle and this Marcus person had stolen millions from clients, had set up Frank to take the fall, and when the pressure became too much, Frank had chosen death over dishonor. Thomas had known. That's why he'd been so desperate to clear Frank's name. He'd suspected his own son of this unspeakable betrayal, but he'd never been able to prove it. And Kyle had let him die carrying that terrible knowledge, never confessing, never admitting the truth. I sat in my chair, magazine still trembling in my hands, and felt something cold and hard crystallize in my chest. This wasn't just about money. This wasn't just about greed. Kyle had destroyed an innocent man, had driven him to suicide, had let that man's family live with the shame of believing their father was a criminal. And he'd been perfectly content to let his deaf mother live out her days in ignorance, never knowing that her son was a monster. That night, I lay awake listening to the sounds of my house, the creaking walls, the settling foundation, the whisper of wind through the eaves. But what I heard most clearly was the sound of my own heart breaking, not just for Frank Patterson and his family, but for the man I'd thought Kyle was, the son who had never really existed. I was no longer just Martha Goretti, the deaf widow. I was Martha Goretti, the secret keeper, the hidden witness, the woman who knew the truth. And I was going to make sure that truth came to light, no matter what it cost. The hardest part about knowing the truth was pretending I didn't. Every time Kyle visited, every time he hugged me with those same hands that had forged documents and destroyed an innocent man's life, I had to fight the urge to pull away in disgust. But I'd learned patience during my years of silence, and now that patience would serve a different purpose, I began to perfect my act with scientific precision. I studied myself in mirrors, practicing the blank expression of someone who couldn't hear footsteps approaching, the slight delay in reaction that came from relying on visual cues, the way my eyes would search faces for context when conversations happened around me. More importantly, I started to really listen. Kyle and Kiva began visiting more frequently, though I soon realized their increased attention had nothing to do with concern for my well-being. They were planning something, and my perceived deafness made me the perfect unwitting audience for their scheming. The house alone is worth at least $2 million, Kiva said during one of their visits, her voice carrying from the kitchen where she was supposedly making tea. And that's not counting the investment accounts or the life insurance money from Thomas. Kyle's response was muffled, but I caught enough to understand they were discussing my assets like I was already dead. She's not going to live forever, Kiva continued, her tone matter-of-fact. And honestly, Kyle, she's not really living now anyway. She just sits in that chair all day, reading the same magazines over and over. It's sad. I was reading in my living room, approximately 15 feet away from this conversation, and they spoke as if I were a piece of furniture. The casual cruelty of it was breathtaking, but their discussions gave me crucial information. They'd been researching my financial situation, had somehow gained access to account statements, and were making plans based on the assumption that I'd remain helpless and dependent until my death. I realized I needed help, but I couldn't risk revealing my hearing to anyone who might inadvertently tip off Kyle and Kiva. So I did something I'd never done before. I became a spy in my own life. The key was Thomas's old study. Kyle had always avoided that room, claiming it was too painful to deal with Dad's things. But I knew Thomas had been meticulous about record-keeping, and if there was evidence of Kyle's crimes, it might be hidden in those files. I started spending time in the study, ostensibly organizing Thomas's papers. To anyone watching, I was just a lonely widow going through her husband's belongings. But I was actually conducting the most important investigation of my life. Thomas had indeed suspected Kyle. I found notebooks filled with his handwriting, documenting discrepancies in account statements, questioning the timing of Frank's discovery of the fraud, noting inconsistencies in Kyle's explanations. He'd been building a case against his own son, but he died before he could complete it. Hidden behind Thomas's diploma, I found a key to a safe deposit box I'd never known existed. Inside that box, I discovered copies of original documents from Frank's firm, financial records that told a very different story than the one Kyle had presented to investigators. Thomas had been gathering evidence, slowly and carefully, trying to prove Frank's innocence and expose the real criminals. But the most damning evidence was a series of recorded phone calls. Thomas had been secretly recording conversations with Kyle, catching him in lies and contradictions. The recordings were fragmentary, but they painted a clear picture of guilt, manipulation, and cold-blooded calculation. I also found correspondence between Thomas and a private investigator named James Morrison, who'd been discreetly looking into the Patterson case. The last letter from Morrison was dated just 2 weeks before Thomas's death, and it mentioned a significant breakthrough in the investigation. I knew I had to contact Morrison, but I couldn't risk doing it from my home phone or in any way that might be traced back to me. So I did something that would have been impossible during my years of actual deafness. I went out alone. I told Kyle I was going to the doctor for a routine checkup. He offered to drive me, but I insisted I wanted to take the bus, part of my independence therapy, I claimed. He looked relieved not to have to spend his afternoon in a medical waiting room. Instead of going to the doctor, I took 3 different buses to reach Morrison's office across town. I wore a scarf and sunglasses, feeling ridiculous but determined. The private investigator was a gruff man in his 60s, with shrewd eyes and a cluttered office that smelled of coffee and old cigarettes. "Mrs. Goretti," he said when I introduced myself. "I wondered if you might come looking for me someday. Your husband was a good man, and he was on the right track." I had to be careful about how much I revealed. I told Morrison that I'd found Thomas's notes and was concerned about Frank Patterson's family, that I wanted to make sure they knew their father hadn't been a criminal. I didn't mention my hearing, instead communicating through written notes and lip reading. Morrison shared what he'd discovered. The fraud had been sophisticated, but not perfect. Kyle and Marcus Chen, Kyle's associate at the firm, had been siphoning money from client accounts for over 2 years, using a complex system of false transactions and forged authorizations. When the scheme grew too large to hide, they needed a scapegoat. Frank Patterson had been the perfect target. As the senior partner, he had access to all accounts and the authority to make large transactions. Kyle and Marcus had gradually altered records to make it appear that Frank was the one making unauthorized transfers, building a paper trail that pointed directly to him. The pressure of the investigation, combined with the betrayal by someone he'd trusted like a son, had driven Frank to despair. He died believing he would be remembered as a thief and a fraud, never knowing that the real criminals were still walking free. "I was close to proving it," Morrison told me. "Your husband had provided me with enough evidence to build a case. But when he died, I lost my client and the family couldn't afford to continue the investigation. I asked Morrison to continue his work, and I paid him with money from a private account Kyle didn't know about. I told him I wanted justice for Frank's family, but I didn't tell him about my larger plan. Because I wasn't just planning to expose Kyle's crimes. I was planning to destroy him completely, the same way he had destroyed Frank Patterson. And I was going to do it slowly, methodically, using the same weapon Kyle had used against me, the belief that I was helpless." With Morrison working on the legal evidence, I turned my attention to psychological warfare. Kyle and Kiva had spent years underestimating me, treating me like a helpless invalid who couldn't affect their plans. They were about to learn that underestimation was the deadliest mistake they could make. I started small, with subtle manipulations that would seem like mere coincidence to them, but would begin to unravel their carefully constructed lives. Kyle had always been careless with personal information around me, assuming my deafness meant I couldn't overhear his phone calls or private conversations. During one of their visits, I overheard him talking to Kiva about a sure-thing stock investment he'd heard about from a contact at his current firm. "Peterson says the biotech company is about to announce a major breakthrough," Kyle said, his voice full of excitement. "If we put in $50,000 now, we could triple our money by Christmas." Kiva was skeptical. "Are you sure this isn't another one of your hunches? We can't afford to lose money right now, especially with the wedding coming up."
Wedding?
I filed that information away for later use. "Trust me," Kyle said. "Peterson has inside information. This is as close to a guarantee as we're going to get." I waited 3 days, then called my own financial advisor, a woman named Sarah Chern who'd been managing my investments for years. I told her I'd heard about the biotech company from a friend and was considering a small investment. "Oh, you mean BioLux Industries?" Sarah said. "Mrs. Goretti, I'd strongly advise against that. My sources tell me they're about to announce a major setback in their drug trials. The FDA is likely to reject their application, and the stock is going to tank."
Perfect.
I made a small investment in BioLux, just enough to make it look like I was following a hunch. Then I casually mentioned to Kyle during his next visit that I'd bought some stock in a biotechnology company based on something I'd read in a magazine. Kyle's face went pale. "What company, Mom?" I pretended to struggle with the name, then showed him the purchase confirmation. BioLux something. The article said they were developing important medicines. Kyle looked like he might be sick. "Mom, you shouldn't make investments without talking to me first. This company, they're very risky." "Oh," I said, looking worried. "Should I sell?" No, Kyle said quickly. You've already bought it. We'll just have to see what happens." I could practically see the wheels turning in his head. If his mother had heard about BioLux, maybe the inside information wasn't so inside after all. Maybe Peterson had been spreading the tip around, which would dilute the potential profits and increase the risk of SEC investigation. 2 days later, I overheard Kyle on the phone with someone, arguing about whether to pull out of the BioLux investment. He was clearly rattled, second-guessing himself, wondering if he'd been set up. When Biolux announced the FDA rejection and their stock price plummeted, Kyle lost $60,000. My small investment lost about $2,000, but it was worth every penny to see the look of stunned disbelief on Kyle's face when he came to check on me. "I'm so sorry, Mom," he said, trying to console me. "These things happen with stocks. It's not your fault." But I could hear the accusation in his voice. He blamed me for spooking him out of his sure thing. He thought my innocent investment had somehow jinxed his own. That was just the beginning. I started paying closer attention to Kyle and Kiva's personal lives, listening for weaknesses I could exploit. I learned that Kiva had a secret shopping addiction, hiding purchases from Kyle and lying about credit card bills. I discovered that Kyle had been gambling online, convinced he could win back his investment losses through poker. During one of their visits, I overheard Kiva on the phone with a friend, complaining about Kyle's gambling habit. "He thinks I don't know," she said, "but I can see the charges on our bank statements. He's lost over $20,000 this month alone." I decided it was time to plant some seeds of mutual suspicion. I started leaving things around the house where Kyle and Kiva would see them. A credit card statement from an old account I'd closed, showing large purchases at expensive stores. A printout of poker websites with handwritten notes about winning strategies. A business card from a marriage counselor with my name written on it. Each item was carefully placed to look accidental, like something I'd been looking at and forgotten to put away. But each one told a story that would resonate with their existing fears and insecurities. Kyle found the credit card statement and assumed it was Kiva's, confirming his suspicions about her spending. Kiva found the poker information and became convinced that Kyle's gambling was even worse than she'd thought. Both of them found the counselor's card and began to wonder if I was somehow aware of their marital problems. The paranoia began to build. I could hear them arguing in hushed tones during their visits, each accusing the other of being careless, of revealing too much around me. They started treating me with a new wariness, as if I might be more perceptive than they'd assumed. "She's been looking at us strangely," Kiva whispered to Kyle one Sunday. "Like she knows something." "She's deaf," Kyle replied, but he sounded less certain than before. "She can't know anything." But doubt was creeping in. I could see it in the way they watched me, the way they censored their conversations even when they thought I wasn't paying attention. The foundation of their confidence was starting to crack. That's when I decided to escalate. The beauty of psychological warfare is that once you plant the seeds of doubt, your targets begin to destroy themselves. Kyle and Kiva were no exception. Their marriage, already strained by financial stress and mutual deception, began to crumble under the weight of their own paranoia. I had learned through my careful eavesdropping that they were planning a wedding, not their own, but Kiva's sister's. They were supposed to be hosting an engagement party that would cost them $15,000 they didn't have. The event was a source of constant stress, with both of them secretly resenting the expense, but unwilling to admit their financial difficulties to Kiva's family. I decided to use this against them. During one of their visits, I made sure to leave a magazine article about financial red flags in marriage prominently displayed on my coffee table. The article discussed how couples often hide debts and spending from each other, and how financial infidelity could destroy relationships. Kyle saw it first. "Mom, what's this?" I looked up from my knitting with an innocent expression.
Oh, that.
I was reading about marriage advice. I was thinking about Thomas and how honest we always were with each other about money. Kyle's face went pale. He clearly thought I was sending him a message about his gambling or Kiva's spending. He took the magazine with him when he left, and I could imagine him poring over it, wondering what I knew and how I'd found out. But the real masterstroke came when I overheard Kyle on the phone with his bookie. "I need more time," he was saying. "The engagement party is this weekend, and I can't let my wife know about the debt. Give me 2 more weeks, and I'll have everything plus interest." 2 weeks. That was all the time I had to work with. I called my financial advisor again, this time asking about short-term loans against my investment portfolio. I told her I was considering helping Kyle and Kiva with a family emergency, but I wanted to understand the tax implications first. Rebecca was helpful, as always, but she mentioned something that gave me a brilliant idea. If you're considering a large gift to your son, she said, you might want to consult with a tax attorney. There are ways to structure these things to minimize the burden on both parties. I thanked Rebecca and hung up, then immediately called a tax attorney named Robert Walsh. I told him I was considering making a significant financial gift to my son, but I was concerned about his ability to manage money responsibly. I want to help him, I explained, but I've heard that large gifts can sometimes create more problems than they solve. Is there a way to structure this so that the money can only be used for specific purposes? Walsh explained several options, including establishing a trust with specific conditions and restrictions. He also mentioned that large financial gifts often require disclosure to the IRS, which could trigger audits of both parties. I thanked him for the information and told him I'd think about it. Then I did something devious. I asked him to send me information about his services to my home address, but I specifically requested that the envelope be marked confidential, estate planning. The envelope arrived 3 days before the engagement party. I made sure to leave it on my kitchen counter, partially opened, with some of the documentation visible. Kyle found it during his next visit. "Mom, what's this?" he asked, holding up the envelope. I looked confused. "Oh, that's from a lawyer. I was asking about, what do you call it, estate planning? I want to make sure everything is in order." Kyle's hands were shaking as he looked at the documents. I could see him reading phrases like tax implications of large gifts and trust structures for financial assistance and disclosure requirements for family transfers. "Mom, are you planning to give me money?" I looked at him with what I hoped was a confused expression. "Well, I know you and Kiva have been stressed about money lately. I thought maybe." How do you know we're stressed about money?" Kyle interrupted. "I had to be very careful here. I can see it in your faces, sweetheart. You both look so tired lately. And I heard Kiva mention something about a party that was expensive." It was a reasonable explanation. Kyle knew I was good at reading body language and facial expressions. It was a skill I developed during my years of deafness. He also knew that Kiva had indeed mentioned the engagement party in front of me, though he probably didn't remember the exact conversation. But the timing was perfect. Here Kyle was, desperate for money to pay off his bookie, and his mother was apparently considering a large financial gift. The problem was that the gift would come with tax implications and legal scrutiny, exactly the kind of attention Kyle couldn't afford. I could see the conflict playing out on his face. He wanted the money desperately, but he was terrified of the legal complications it might bring. "Mom, we don't need any money. We're fine." "Are you sure? Because I have more than I need, and I'd rather help you now than leave everything to you later." Kyle looked like he was going to be sick.
No, Mom.
"Really? We're fine." But I wasn't done. That evening, I called Kiva's cell phone. She answered on the third ring, sounding harried. "Hi, Kiva," I said. "I hope I'm not bothering you. I wanted to talk to you about something."
Martha.
"What's up?" "Well, I was talking to Kyle about money today, and he seemed very stressed. I offered to help with your financial situation, but he said you didn't need anything." There was a long pause.
He said what?
"He said you were fine financially. But I can see that you're both worried about something. If there's anything I can do..." I could hear Kiva's breathing change. "Martha, what exactly did Kyle tell you about our finances?" "Nothing specific. Just that you were fine and didn't need help. But I've been thinking about estate planning lately, and I have more money than I need. I thought maybe I could help with the engagement party or whatever is causing you stress." Another pause. "Kyle told you about the engagement party?" Well, not exactly. I just, I can see that you're both working very hard to make it special for your sister. I was walking a careful line here, revealing just enough to plant seeds of doubt without claiming knowledge I shouldn't have. Kiva's response told me everything I needed to know. Martha, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Has Kyle told you about any financial problems we're having?
No, dir.
He just seems stressed lately. Is there something wrong? I don't know. But if you're serious about helping with the party, that would be amazing. It's costing us $15,000 and honestly, we're struggling to cover it.
Perfect.
Of course I'd be happy to help. Should I write a check to you or to Kyle? Maybe you should write it to me. I'm handling most of the party planning anyway. I could hear the calculation in her voice. She was already planning to accept my help without telling Kyle, which would give her power over him and ensure that the money was used for what she wanted. That sounds perfect, I said. I'll write you a check tomorrow. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen and smiled. By tomorrow evening, Kyle would discover that his wife had accepted money from his mother without telling him, money that he'd explicitly refused. Meanwhile, Kiva would learn that Kyle had been hiding their financial problems from his mother, making her look like a fool for accepting help. And both of them would be wondering what else I knew and how much I'd been observing their supposedly private struggles. The engagement party was going to be very interesting. The engagement party was a disaster, though not in the way anyone expected. Kyle and Kiva managed to pull off the event itself, a lovely garden party at a local country club, complete with string quartet and elaborate floral arrangements. But the real drama was happening behind the scenes. Kyle had discovered Kiva's acceptance of my gift when he saw her depositing the check. The fight that followed was spectacular, though they tried to keep it quiet around the other guests. I watched from my corner table, pretending to be absorbed in conversation with Kiva's aunt while actually listening to every whispered accusation and counter-accusation. You went behind my back, Kyle hissed at Kiva during a quiet moment. I specifically told you we didn't need her money. We're broke, Kyle. Kiva whispered back. Your gambling debts are crushing us, and you're too proud to accept help from your own mother. My gambling debts? What about your credit card bills? What about the $20,000 you spent on clothes last month? That's different, and you know it. They were starting to unravel publicly, and other guests were beginning to notice.
But I wasn't finished with them yet.
The next phase of my plan required patience and precision. I had to wait for the right moment to spring my trap, and I had to make sure all the pieces were in place first. Morrison, my private investigator, had been busy. He'd uncovered additional evidence of Kyle's fraud, including bank records that showed the pattern of transfers from Frank Patterson's clients' accounts to shell companies controlled by Kyle and Marcus Chen. He'd also discovered that Marcus had been skimming money from his current firm, using the same methods he'd learned during the Patterson scheme. More importantly, Morrison had made contact with Frank Patterson's widow, Ellen. She'd been living in quiet shame for 7 years, believing her husband had been a criminal. When Morrison showed her the evidence of Kyle's guilt, she'd been willing to do whatever it took to clear her husband's name. Ellen had agreed to file a wrongful death lawsuit against Kyle and Marcus, but we needed more evidence to make the case ironclad. That's where my secret weapon came in, the recorded conversations Thomas had made before his death. I had digitized Thomas's old cassette recordings and given copies to Morrison, but I'd kept the originals hidden in my house. Now I needed to use them as bait to get Kyle to incriminate himself further. I started leaving subtle hints around the house that I was organizing Thomas's old belongings. I mentioned to Kyle that I'd found some of his father's old business files and was thinking about donating them to charity. Some of it looks important, I told him during one of his visits. There are recordings and papers about his work with Frank Patterson. I should probably throw them away, but I thought maybe you'd want to look through them first. Kyle's reaction was everything I'd hoped for. His face went white, and he struggled to keep his voice casual. Recordings? What kind of recordings? Oh, you know your father. He recorded everything. Phone calls, meetings, conversations. He said it helped him remember details for his clients. Kyle's hands were shaking. Mom, maybe I should take care of those files for you. They're probably boring business stuff, but they might contain sensitive information about Dad's clients. That's very thoughtful, dear. They're all in boxes in the basement, but some of them are quite heavy. I'll get them, Kyle said quickly.
Don't worry about it.
That night, I heard Kyle in the basement, frantically searching through boxes. He was looking for the recordings, trying to destroy evidence of his crimes. But the joke was on him. I'd already removed all the incriminating material weeks ago. What I'd left behind were decoy recordings, Thomas discussing legitimate business matters, client meetings, and routine phone calls. But I'd also left one very special recording right where Kyle would find it. It was a conversation between Thomas and Frank Patterson, recorded just a week before Frank's death. In it, Thomas expressed his concerns about some financial discrepancies he'd noticed, and Frank sounded worried and confused. I don't understand how this happened, Thomas, Frank's voice said through the static. These transactions. I never authorized any of these transfers. Someone's been using my passwords, my access codes. But who would do such a thing? Thomas's response was heartbreaking.
I don't know, Frank.
But we'll figure it out. We'll find whoever did this and make sure they pay for it. The recording was authentic, but I'd edited it carefully. I'd removed the parts where Thomas expressed suspicion about Kyle, leaving only Frank's confusion and Thomas's promise to find the truth. Kyle found the recording, and I could hear him playing it over and over in the basement. He was probably trying to figure out how much his father had known, how much danger he was in. What Kyle didn't know was that I had hidden a small digital recorder in the basement, tucked behind some old Christmas decorations. I was capturing every word he said, every phone call he made while he thought he was alone. And Kyle predictably called Marcus. "We have a problem," Kyle said. "My mother found some of Dad's old recordings. There's one with Frank talking about unauthorized transfers." Marcus's voice was tinny through the phone speaker, but I could hear him clearly. "What exactly does it say?" Frank sounds confused, like he doesn't know what happened. But he mentions someone using his passwords. If the wrong people hear this. "Calm down," Marcus said. "Frank's dead. He can't hurt us now. And your mother's deaf. She doesn't even know what she found. But what if she gives the recordings to someone else? What if she decides to donate them to Frank's family or something?" There was a pause. "Then we need to make sure that doesn't happen." "What do you mean?" "Kyle, your mother is old, she's deaf, and she's been depressed since your father died. Accidents happen to people like that." The temperature in my house seemed to drop 10 degrees. They were talking about killing me. "Marcus, I can't. She's my mother. She's also the only thing standing between us and prison. Think about it, Kyle. She has no quality of life anyway. She just sits in that house all day, alone and miserable. We'd be doing her a favor. I need to think about this." "Don't think too long. Every day those recordings exist is another day we're in danger." Kyle hung up, and I could hear him pacing around the basement. He was wrestling with the decision to murder his own mother, and from the sound of his breathing, he was seriously considering it. I had everything I needed now. Kyle had just confessed to fraud, conspiracy, and was now planning murder. The digital recorder had captured it all, and I had witnesses who could testify to my mental competence and the authenticity of the recordings. But I wasn't ready to spring the trap yet. I wanted Kyle to suffer the way Frank Patterson had suffered. I wanted him to feel the walls closing in, to experience the despair and hopelessness that had driven an innocent man to suicide. So I began the final phase of my plan, making Kyle believe he was losing his mind. The psychological torture began in earnest the next week. I started small, moving objects around the house when Kyle visited, making him question his own memory. I'd put his reading glasses in different places, rearrange books on shelves, move his coffee cup while he was in the bathroom. Mom, did you move my glasses? He'd ask, looking confused. I haven't touched anything, dear. I'd reply innocently. Are you feeling all right? You seem distracted lately. I began leaving newspaper clippings around the house, articles about financial fraud, about criminals being caught years after their crimes, about the importance of justice for victims' families. I'd highlight certain passages and leave them where Kyle would see them, then act confused when he asked about them. I don't remember cutting those out, I'd say, looking genuinely puzzled. Maybe your father left them. You know how he was always reading about business ethics. Kyle was starting to crack. I could see it in his eyes, the way his hands shook when he thought no one was looking. He was sleeping poorly, jumping at shadows, questioning everything around him. But the real masterpiece was the phone calls. I had discovered that Kyle's cell phone number was very similar to another number in the area, off by just one digit. It was easy enough to call that other number and hang up when someone answered, but Kyle's phone would show a missed call from a number he didn't recognize. I started calling him in the middle of the night, letting it ring once or twice before hanging up. When he tried to call back, he'd reach a confused stranger who had no idea what he was talking about. Someone's calling me from your number, Kyle would tell these people. Did you call me? I don't know who you are, they'd reply. I haven't called anyone. Kyle began to think he was being watched, that someone was playing mind games with him. He started looking over his shoulder, checking his locks obsessively, screening his calls. And then I played my final card. I had Morrison arrange for Ellen Patterson to be at the grocery store I knew Kyle frequented. Ellen didn't know Kyle by sight, but Morrison had shown her photos, so she'd recognize him. When she saw Kyle in the produce section, she was supposed to approach him and ask if he'd known her husband. Kyle called me that evening, his voice shaking. Mom, the strangest thing happened today. This woman at the grocery store said she recognized me. She said I looked like someone who used to work with her husband. Oh, what was her husband's name? Frank Patterson. I let out a small gasp. Frank Patterson? But Kyle, that was your father's business partner. The one who... I trailed off, as if I couldn't bring myself to say it. Yeah, the one who stole all that money and killed himself. But Mom, this woman was looking at me like she knew something. She kept staring at me, and when I tried to walk away, she followed me. That's very strange, dear. What did she want? She said she was looking for the truth about what happened to her husband. She said she didn't believe he was guilty. I was quiet for a moment, letting Kyle's paranoia build. Kyle, you don't think... I mean, your father was always so upset about Frank's death. He never believed Frank was guilty either. What are you saying, Mom? I'm probably just being silly, but what if Frank really was innocent? What if someone else was responsible for what happened? Kyle's breathing became labored. Mom, that's impossible. The evidence was clear. Frank was stealing from clients. But what if someone made it look that way? What if someone wanted Frank to take the blame? Why would you even think that? Because, Kyle, your father found some things before he died. Things that made him question what really happened. He was very troubled by it. What kind of things? I don't know exactly, but he was doing some kind of investigation. He had files, recordings, phone numbers written down. He was trying to prove Frank was innocent. Kyle was quiet for a long moment. Mom, where are those files now? I don't know. I gave most of his papers to charity, but there might be something still in the basement. Why? I think I should look through them. Make sure there's nothing that would upset Frank's family if they found out about it. That's very thoughtful of you, dear. But Kyle wasn't being thoughtful. He was terrified. He spent the next 3 days tearing apart my basement, looking for evidence that might implicate him. He was so focused on finding and destroying potential evidence that he didn't notice I was watching him from the top of the stairs, recording every moment of his frantic search. That's when I decided it was time for the final confrontation. I called Kyle and Kiva, asking them to come for Sunday dinner. I told them I had something important to discuss with them about the family's future. They arrived looking nervous and suspicious. Kyle kept glancing around the house, as if he expected Frank Patterson's ghost to materialize in the corners. Kiva was checking her phone constantly, probably hoping for an excuse to leave early. I served them Thomas's favorite meal, pot roast with Yorkshire pudding, and made small talk about the weather and the neighborhood news. But I could see the tension building in both of them. They knew something was coming. After dinner, I invited them to sit in the living room. I took my usual chair, the one where I'd spent so many hours pretending to be deaf, while listening to their cruel plans and casual cruelties. I asked you both here because I have something important to tell you, I began. Something that's going to change everything. Kyle and Kiva exchanged glances. What is it, Mom? Kyle asked. I looked at them both, these two people who had plotted to steal from me, who had discussed murdering me, who had spent years treating me like I was already dead. And I smiled. I can't hear you, I said simply. The silence that followed was deafening. Kyle's face went white, then red, then white again. Kiva's mouth fell open, and she made a small choking sound. What did you say? Kyle whispered. I said I can hear you. I've been able to hear for months now. Every word you've said, every plan you've made, every cruel comment you thought I couldn't understand. Kyle stood up abruptly, his chair falling backwards. That's impossible. You're deaf. You've been deaf for years. I had surgery, an experimental procedure. My hearing was restored, but I decided not to tell you right away. Thank God I didn't. Kiva found her voice. How long have you been able to hear? Long enough to know about the engagement party expenses. Long enough to know about Kyle's gambling debts and your shopping addiction. Long enough to know about Frank Patterson. Kyle's legs gave out, and he sat down heavily on the couch. Mom, I don't know what you think you heard, but I heard everything, Kyle. I heard you talking to Marcus about the fraud. I heard you discussing how you framed Frank for your crimes. I heard you planning to kill me. You're confused, Kyle said desperately. You're old, you're sick, you don't understand what you heard. I reached into my purse and pulled out a small digital recorder. Would you like to hear your voice discussing how to make my death look like an accident? Because I have it all recorded right here. Kyle lunged for the recorder, but I was ready for him. I'd moved it to the other side of the room while he was distracted. Don't bother, I said calmly. That's just one copy. There are others in safe places, along with all the evidence Thomas collected before he died. Kiva was crying now, mascara running down her cheeks. Martha, please. We never meant for any of this to happen. We were just trying to make ends meet. You were trying to make ends meet by stealing from elderly clients? By driving an innocent man to suicide? By planning to murder me? We weren't really going to hurt you, Kyle said. Marcus was just talking. We would never actually. Your father knew, I interrupted. He knew what you'd done to Frank, and it broke his heart. He spent his final months trying to prove Frank's innocence, trying to find a way to expose you without destroying our family. But you let him die carrying that terrible knowledge. Kyle was sobbing now, his face in his hands. Mom, please.
I'm sorry.
I'm so sorry. You're sorry you got caught. You're sorry your plans failed. But you're not sorry for what you did to Frank Patterson or his family. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the garden Thomas had planted for me years ago. Frank Patterson was a good man. He was your father's best friend, and he trusted you like a son. And you destroyed him for money. It wasn't supposed to happen like that, Kyle said weakly. The scheme got out of hand. We never meant for Frank to kill himself. But you let him die believing he was a criminal. You let his family live in shame. You let his children grow up thinking their father was a thief. I turned back to face them. That ends now. What do you mean?
Kiva asked.
I'm going to give all the evidence to the police. I'm going to make sure Frank Patterson's name is cleared and his family gets the justice they deserve. And I'm going to make sure you both pay for what you've done. Kyle looked up at me with something that might have been hope. Mom, we're family. We can work this out. We can make it right.
No, Kyle.
We can't. You stopped being my son the moment you let Frank Patterson die for your crimes. And you stopped being human the moment you planned to kill me. I walked to the front door and opened it. Get out of my house. Both of you. And don't ever come back. Kyle and Kiva stood frozen for a moment, as if they couldn't believe what was happening. Then Kyle tried one last desperate plea. Mom, you don't understand. If you turn us in, you'll lose everything. The scandal, the publicity, it will destroy you too. I looked at him with the cold contempt he deserved. Kyle, I've already lost everything that mattered to me. Thomas is dead. My only child is a murderer. What more can you possibly take from me? You'll be alone, he said. I've been alone for years, Kyle. The only difference is that now I know why. They left without another word, and I locked the door behind them. Then I sat in my chair and called Morrison. It's time, I told him. Make the calls. The arrests happened at dawn on a Tuesday morning, exactly 1 week after my confrontation with Kyle and Kiva. I wasn't there to see it, but Morrison described it to me later with the satisfaction of a man who'd waited 7 years for justice. Kyle was taken into custody at his home, still in his pajamas, while Kiva watched from the bedroom window. Marcus Chun was arrested at his office, led away in handcuffs, while his colleagues and clients looked on in shock. The charges were extensive: conspiracy to commit fraud, grand theft, forgery, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit murder. The evidence was overwhelming: Thomas's original documentation, my recordings of their conversations, financial records Morrison had uncovered, and testimony from other victims who had come forward once the story broke. The news media picked up the story immediately. Son frames father's business partner for fraud, plans mother's murder, was the headline in the morning paper. By afternoon, it was national news. I had prepared myself for the publicity, but I wasn't prepared for the sheer intensity of it. Reporters camped outside my house. Neighbors I'd barely spoken to in years suddenly wanted to be interviewed, and my phone rang constantly with calls from producers wanting to tell my story. But the most satisfying call came from Ellen Patterson. Mrs. Goretti, she said, her voice thick with emotion. I don't know how to thank you. For 7 years, I've lived with the shame of believing my husband was a criminal. My children have carried that burden. Frank died thinking he would be remembered as a thief. Your husband was a good man, Ellen. Everyone will know that now. But the cost to you, losing your son this way? I was quiet for a moment, thinking about Kyle and the boy he used to be, before greed and selfishness had poisoned his soul. Ellen, I didn't lose my son. I discovered that the son I thought I had never really existed. That's not loss, that's clarity. The legal proceedings took nearly 2 years. Kyle and Marcus tried to negotiate plea deals, but the evidence was too strong and the public outrage too intense. The prosecutor, a young woman named Sarah Mitchell, was determined to see justice done. This case represents everything wrong with financial crimes, she told the media. These men didn't just steal money. They stole a man's reputation, his dignity, his will to live. They drove Frank Patterson to suicide and then planned to murder an elderly woman to cover their tracks. There will be no deals, no reduced sentences. They're going to prison for a long time. Kyle's lawyer tried to paint him as a victim of circumstances, a man who had made mistakes but didn't deserve to have his life destroyed. But the recordings of him discussing my murder made that defense impossible. Kiva turned state's evidence, hoping to save herself. She testified that Kyle had been the mastermind behind the fraud, that she had only learned about it after they were married, that she had been afraid to leave him because he had threatened her. It was all lies, of course. I had recordings of Kiva actively participating in the planning, encouraging Kyle to steal more money, even suggesting targets among my own friends and neighbors. But her testimony did provide additional evidence against Kyle and Marcus. The trial lasted 6 months and was a media circus. Every day brought new revelations about the scope of their crimes, the sophistication of their fraud, the callousness of their planning. The courtroom was packed with reporters, victims' families, and curious onlookers. I testified on the second day, telling the jury about the years of abuse, the casual cruelty, the way they had treated me like I was already dead. I played the recordings of their conversations, watching as Kyle's face crumpled with each damning word. They didn't just steal money, I told the jury. They stole Frank Patterson's life, his reputation, his family's peace of mind. They stole my trust in my own son. They stole 7 years of grief and shame from people who deserved to remember Frank as the good man he was. The defense attorney tried to discredit me, suggesting that I had manipulated the situation, that I had entrapped Kyle and Marcus by pretending to be deaf. But the jury wasn't buying it. Mrs. Goretti, the prosecutor asked during redirect, "Do you regret keeping your hearing a secret from your son?" "No," I said firmly. If I had told Kyle immediately about my surgery, Frank Patterson would still be remembered as a criminal. The real criminals would still be free, and I would probably be dead. The verdict came after 3 days of deliberation. Guilty on all counts. Kyle got 25 years in federal prison. Marcus got 30. Kiva, despite her cooperation, received 10 years for her role in the conspiracy. As the sentences were read, I watched Kyle's face. He looked older than his 42 years, broken by the weight of his crimes and the certainty of his punishment. For a moment, I felt a flicker of the old maternal love, the instinct to protect him from harm. But then I remembered Frank Patterson's funeral, the way his children had wept with shame as well as grief. I remembered the recordings of Kyle discussing my murder with the same casual tone he might use to discuss the weather. The flicker died. After the sentencing, Kyle's lawyer approached me in the courthouse hallway. "Mrs. Goretti, Kyle would like to see you. He wants to apologize, to try to make things right." I looked at this young man, barely older than Kyle, and saw the hope in his eyes. He probably believed that families could heal, that love could conquer all, that there was always a path back from the darkest crimes. "Tell Kyle that Frank Patterson wanted to apologize too," I said. "Tell him that Frank spent his last days trying to figure out how to make things right with the clients he thought he'd robbed. Tell him that Frank died believing he was a criminal, while Kyle lived knowing he was innocent." The lawyer's face fell. "Mrs. Goretti, please. He's your son." "No," I said. "He's a murderer who shares my DNA. That's not the same thing." I walked away without looking back. The months following the trial were strange and difficult. The media attention gradually died down, but the quiet that followed felt different from the silence I'd known during my years of deafness. This was the quiet of justice served, of truth finally spoken, of accounts settled. Kyle wrote me letters from prison. I didn't read them. I had them forwarded to Ellen Patterson, thinking she might want to know what remorse looked like, even if it came too late to matter. Ellen called me after receiving the first letter. "He's asking for forgiveness," she said. "He says he's found religion, that he wants to make amends." "What do you think about that?" "I think Frank would have forgiven him. Frank was a better person than I am. But forgiveness doesn't erase consequences, does it?" "No," I agreed. "It doesn't." I used the money from Kyle's seized assets to establish the Frank Patterson Foundation for Financial Crime Victims. The foundation provided legal assistance to people who had been defrauded, counseling for families dealing with financial betrayal, and support for the children of white-collar criminals. Ellen Patterson became the foundation's first director. She had a passion for the work that came from personal experience and she understood better than anyone how financial crimes ripple through families and communities. "We can't bring Frank back," she told me during one of our planning meetings, "but we can make sure his death meant something." The foundation grew quickly. We discovered that financial fraud was epidemic, that elderly victims were particularly vulnerable, that families were often torn apart by the discovery of crimes committed by people they trusted. We helped dozens of families in the first year alone. I also began speaking at conferences and seminars, telling my story to law enforcement officers, social workers, and victim advocates. I talked about the warning signs of elder abuse, the importance of listening to victims, and the need for justice that went beyond financial restitution. The money was never the point, I would tell audiences. They stole more than my assets. They stole my dignity, my trust, my faith in family. They stole years of peace from Frank Patterson's family. Financial crimes are about power and control, not just money. The speaking engagements led to a book deal. I wrote my memoir with the help of a ghostwriter, a young woman named Jennifer, who had lost her own grandfather to a financial scam. The book, The Silent Witness, became a bestseller and brought even more attention to the issue of elder financial abuse. But the most meaningful change was in my personal life. I was no longer the isolated, grieving widow I had been. I had purpose now, and with purpose came connections to other people who shared my passion for justice. I became close friends with Morrison, the private investigator who had helped me expose Kyle's crimes. He was a widower himself, and we understood each other's loss and resilience. We didn't become romantically involved. We were both too old and too scarred for that, but we became true companions, people who could sit in comfortable silence or talk for hours about our work. I also developed friendships with other crime victims and their families. We formed an informal support group that met monthly at my house. We shared stories, offered advice, and reminded each other that surviving betrayal was a victory in itself. You know what the best revenge is? Ask Margaret, an 80-year-old woman whose nephew had stolen her life savings. Living well, living freely, living without shame. She was right. The best revenge against Kyle and Kiva wasn't their prison sentences or their public disgrace. It was the fact that I had built a meaningful life from the ashes of their betrayal. I renovated my house, turning Thomas's old study into an office for the foundation. I traveled to conferences and speaking engagements, seeing parts of the country I'd never visited before. I learned to use a computer, started a blog about financial crime prevention, and even appeared on television shows to discuss elder abuse. Most importantly, I learned to trust again. Not blindly, not naively, but with the hard-won wisdom of someone who had been betrayed and survived. I built relationships with people who earned my trust through their actions, not their words. Kyle continued to write letters. I continued to ignore them. Some people thought I was being cruel, that I should give him a chance to make amends. But I had learned the difference between forgiveness and reconciliation. I could forgive Kyle for my own peace of mind, but I didn't have to welcome him back into my life. "He's still your son," my neighbor Mrs. Rodriguez said one day. "Blood is thicker than water." "Actually," I replied, "the full saying is, the blood of the covenant is thicker than the water of the womb." It means that relationships based on choice and commitment are stronger than those based on biology. I had chosen my new family, Ellen Patterson, Morrison, the crime victims who had become my friends, the staff and volunteers at the foundation. These people had earned their place in my life through loyalty, honesty, and shared values. Kyle had forfeited his place through betrayal, greed, and the ultimate violation of trust. As the third anniversary of the trial approached, I received an unexpected visitor. It was Kiva, recently released from prison, looking thin and nervous. "Hello, Martha," she said when I opened the door. "I know you probably don't want to see me, but I wanted to apologize." I studied her face, looking for signs of genuine remorse or continued deception. What I saw was mostly fear. What do you want, Kiva? I want to make amends. I want to take responsibility for what I did. I've been in therapy, and I understand now how wrong we were. You understand that planning to murder me was wrong? How enlightened of you. She flinched. I know you have every right to hate me, but I was hoping you might consider giving me a second chance. A second chance at what? At being family. At being the daughter-in-law you deserved. I almost laughed. Kiva, you were never my daughter-in-law. You were a stranger who married my son for money and then tried to steal from me. Prison didn't change that. People can change, Martha. I have changed. Maybe you have, but I've changed too. I've learned that forgiveness doesn't require reconciliation. I can forgive you for my own peace of mind, but I don't have to trust you with my life again. Kiva's face crumpled. So, there's no chance? No possibility of forgiveness. I forgive you, Kiva. I forgive you for being weak, for being greedy, for being willing to destroy an innocent man's reputation. I forgive you for treating me like I was already dead, for planning to steal my assets, for considering my murder. Her eyes filled with hope. But I will never trust you again. I will never welcome you into my home again. I will never treat you like family again. Forgiveness is not the same as forgetting. She left without another word, and I watched her walk down my street for the last time. I felt sad for her, but not sorry. Some bridges, once burned, cannot be rebuilt. That evening, I called Ellen Patterson. How are you holding up? She asked. I'm good, I said, and realized I meant it. I'm really good. The foundation is doing amazing work. Frank would be so proud. Your husband was a good man, Ellen. He deserved better than what Kyle and Marcus did to him.
He did.
But you know what? I think Frank would be proud of what came from his death. The foundation, the lives we've helped, the criminals we've exposed. That's his legacy now, not the lies Kyle told about him. She was right. Frank Patterson's death had been transformed from a tragedy into a catalyst for justice. That was worth something. After I hung up, I sat in my garden and listened to the evening sounds, birds settling in for the night, the distant hum of traffic, the whisper of wind through leaves. The same sounds that had been my miracle when my hearing first returned. I thought about Kyle, locked in his cell, writing letters I would never read. I thought about Kiva, trying to rebuild a life without the foundation of trust she had destroyed. I thought about Marcus serving his sentence and probably planning his next scheme. And I thought about Frank Patterson, whose death had been the seed from which all this justice had grown. I had been silent for so long, first by disability, then by choice. But silence had been my weapon, my shield, my path to truth. I had learned to listen, really listen, to the world around me. And in that listening, I had found my voice. My new voice was stronger than my old one. It spoke for victims who couldn't speak for themselves, for families torn apart by financial crimes, for elderly people who were dismissed and underestimated by those who should have protected them. I was no longer Martha Goretti, the deaf widow. I was Martha Goretti, the advocate, the survivor, the woman who had turned betrayal into purpose and silence into strength. And I was just getting started. 5 years after the trial, I was invited to speak at the National Conference on Elder Financial Abuse. The audience was packed with law enforcement officers, social workers, victim advocates, and survivors. As I looked out at the sea of faces, I saw my own story reflected back at me. People who had been betrayed, who had fought back, who had refused to let their victimization define them. My name is Martha Goretti, I began, and I want to tell you about the power of listening. I told them about the silence of deafness, about the different silence of choice, about the things you can hear when you're truly paying attention. I told them about Kyle and Kiva, about Frank Patterson, about the moment I realized that my perceived weakness was actually my greatest strength. But mostly, I told them about the life I had built from the ashes of betrayal. The Frank Patterson Foundation had helped over 3,000 families by then. We had exposed dozens of financial criminals, recovered millions in stolen assets, and changed laws in 12 states to better protect elderly victims. We had turned Frank's death into a force for justice that continued to grow every year. The criminals counted on my silence, I told the audience. They counted on my isolation, my helplessness, my supposed inability to fight back. They saw an elderly, disabled woman and assumed I was powerless. I paused, looking out at the faces in the crowd. They were wrong. The applause was thunderous, but what moved me most were the faces of the survivors in the audience. I saw recognition there, validation, the knowledge that their stories mattered too. After my speech, I was approached by a young woman named Sarah, probably in her 20s, with tears in her eyes. "Mrs. Goretti," she said, "my grandmother was scammed by her own son. He took everything, her savings, her house, her dignity. She was too ashamed to tell anyone for years. When she finally admitted what happened, she said she felt like she was nothing, like she was just a burden." "What happened to her?" "She died last year, still believing she was worthless. But when I heard your story, I realized she wasn't worthless. She was a victim, but she was also a survivor. She lived through the betrayal and found ways to be happy again." I took Sarah's hands in mine. "Your grandmother was a warrior. She faced the ultimate betrayal and kept going. That takes incredible strength. I want to do something to help people like her. I want to make sure other families don't go through what we went through." "Then come work with us," I said. "The foundation can always use people who understand the real cost of these crimes." Sarah joined our staff 6 months later and became one of our most effective advocates. She had the passion that comes from personal experience, the same fire that had driven Ellen Patterson and me to build something meaningful from our pain. That's how the foundation grew, one story at a time, one survivor at a time, one family at a time. We became a network of people who refused to let financial criminals win, who turned their victimization into advocacy, their pain into purpose. I was 70 years old by then, and people started asking me about retirement. The idea seemed absurd. Why would I retire from work that gave my life meaning? Why would I step back from a fight that was far from over? Instead, I began training others to carry on the work. Ellen Patterson had become an expert in her own right, speaking at conferences and consulting with law enforcement agencies. Morrison had started a security firm that specialized in protecting elderly clients from financial predators. Sarah and our other young advocates were building their own reputations as fighters for justice. The foundation would outlive me, and that was exactly what I wanted. Kyle's letters had stopped coming years ago. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he had been transferred to a different prison, that he was in poor health, that he had given up hope of reconciliation with me. I felt no satisfaction in his suffering, but I felt no sorrow either. He had made his choices, and now he was living with the consequences. Kiva had disappeared entirely. Some said she had moved to another state, changed her name, tried to start fresh. Others thought she might have left the country. I didn't care enough to find out. She was no longer part of my story. Marcus Daniel had been released on parole after serving 22 years of his 30-year sentence. He had immediately violated his parole by attempting to start another investment scheme, and he was back in prison within 6 months. Some people never learn, never change, never accept responsibility for their actions. But I had learned something important from my experience. The best revenge isn't the destruction of your enemies, it's the construction of something better from what they tried to destroy. Frank Patterson's name was now synonymous with integrity and justice. His family had established a scholarship fund for students studying financial ethics. His story was taught in business schools as an example of how innocent people can be destroyed by corporate crime. My own story had become something I never expected, a source of hope for other victims. I received hundreds of letters from people who had been betrayed by family members, scammed by strangers, or abused by people they trusted. Many of them said my story had given them the courage to fight back, to seek justice, to refuse to be defined by their victimization. "You showed us that silence can be a weapon," one letter said. "You showed us that being underestimated can be an advantage. You showed us that survival is a form of victory." That was my legacy. Not the destruction of Kyle and Kiva, but the empowerment of people who had been told they were powerless. On my 70th birthday, Ellen Patterson threw a party for me at the foundation offices. The room was filled with people whose lives had been touched by our work, crime victims who had found justice, families who had been reunited, elderly people who had been protected from predators. "Martha," Ellen said during her toast, "you turned the worst betrayal into the greatest gift. You turned your silence into a voice for thousands of people who needed to be heard." I looked around the room at the faces of people who had become my chosen family. These were relationships built on trust, respect, and shared values. They were stronger than any biological connection I had ever known. "I learned something important from my experience," I told the crowd. "Blood doesn't make you family. Loyalty makes you family. Trust makes you family. Love makes you family." I raised my glass to the room. To Frank Patterson, who deserved better than what he got, but whose memory has made the world a better place. To every victim who refused to stay silent. To every survivor who turned their pain into purpose. To every person who proved that the human spirit is unbreakable. The applause was warm and genuine, but what moved me most was the sense of community in the room. These people were my real family, bound together not by genetics but by shared experience and common purpose. Later that evening, I sat in my garden, the same garden where I had first heard the bird song that announced my return to the world of sound. The house was quiet now, but it was a different kind of quiet than the silence of my deaf years. This was the quiet of contentment, of work well done, of justice served. I thought about Thomas and how proud he would be of what I had accomplished. He had known the truth about Kyle but had died before he could act on it. I had finished what he started, and I had done it in a way that honored his memory and his values. I thought about Frank Patterson and how his death had become the seed from which so much good had grown. His family had found peace, his reputation had been restored, and his legacy was now one of justice rather than shame. I thought about the thousands of people whose lives had been changed by our work, who had found the courage to speak up, seek help, and fight back against those who had betrayed them. And I thought about Kyle and Kiva, locked away in their separate prisons, probably still wondering how their perfect plan had gone so wrong. They had underestimated me because I was old, because I was deaf, because I was a woman, because I was alone. They had seen weakness where there was strength, silence where there was strategy, helplessness where there was power. Their mistake had been my opportunity, and I had seized it with both hands. The stars were coming out now, and I could hear the evening sounds of my neighborhood, dogs barking, children playing, families settling in for the night. The sounds of life continuing, of people living and loving and building futures together. I was 72 years old, and I had learned that age is not a limitation, it's a liberation. I had learned that loss is not an ending, it's a beginning. I had learned that betrayal is not a death sentence, it's a wake-up call. Most importantly, I had learned that silence is not emptiness, it's potential. In the silence of my deafness, I had found patience. In the silence of my secret, I had found strength. In the silence of my listening, I had found truth. I had been silent for so long that when I finally spoke, the whole world heard me. My name is Martha Goretti, and this is my journey. This is her journey. And it's far from over. 3 years later. I'm 75 now, and my hearing isn't what it used to be. The doctors say it's natural aging, not a return of my old condition, but sometimes I wonder if my body is preparing me for another kind of silence, the final one that comes to all of us eventually. I'm not afraid of that silence. I've learned that endings are just transitions, that death is just another form of change. The work will continue without me, carried on by the people I've trained, the lives I've touched, the systems I've helped create. The Frank Patterson Foundation has grown beyond anything I could have imagined. We have offices in 12 states, a staff of over 200 people, and partnerships with law enforcement agencies across the country. We've helped over 10,000 families, recovered more than $50 million in stolen assets, and contributed to the prosecution of hundreds of financial criminals. But more than that, we've changed the conversation about elder abuse. We've shown that elderly people are not helpless victims, but powerful advocates for justice. We've proven that silence can be a weapon, that listening can be a form of activism, that survival can be a victory. Kyle died in prison last year. I learned about it from a lawyer who was handling his estate, what little there was of it. He had left me a letter, written years ago but never sent, in which he apologized for his crimes and asked for my forgiveness. I read the letter once, then burned it. Not out of anger, but out of closure. Kyle had been my son, and I had loved him with all my heart. But the man who had betrayed Frank Patterson, who had planned my murder, who had chosen greed over family, that man was a stranger to me. His apology couldn't change what he had done, and his death couldn't undo the damage he had caused. I felt sad for the boy he had been, the potential he had wasted, the life he had thrown away. But I felt no grief for the man he had become. Ellen Patterson retired from the foundation last year, passing the directorship to Sarah, the young woman who had approached me after my speech years ago. Ellen and I remain close friends, bonded by our shared loss and our shared purpose. She often jokes that Frank would be amazed to know that his death had led to so much good. He always said every cloud has a silver lining, she told me recently. I think he would consider the foundation to be his silver lining. I've been working on my second book, a guide for families dealing with financial crime. It's more practical than my memoir, less about my story and more about how others can protect themselves and their loved ones. The working title is Listen Carefully: A Survival Guide for Financial Betrayal. The book includes chapters on recognizing warning signs, gathering evidence, working with law enforcement, and rebuilding trust after betrayal. But the most important chapter is about the power of listening, really listening to the people and situations around you. Trust your instincts, I write. If something feels wrong, it probably is. If someone's behavior doesn't match their words, pay attention to the behavior. If you're being pressured to make quick decisions about money, slow down and ask questions. The book also includes a section on turning victimization into advocacy, on finding purpose in pain, on building new families from the ashes of betrayal. You are not defined by what happens to you, I write. You are defined by how you respond to what happens to you. You are not a victim. You are a survivor. You are not powerless. You are powerful. You are not alone. You are part of a community of people who refuse to let criminals win. The book will be published next year, and I hope it will help other families avoid the pain that mine endured. But even if it helps just one person, even if it saves just one life, it will have been worth writing. I spend my days now in a gentler routine. I still go to the foundation offices twice a week, but mostly I work from home, answering letters from victims, consulting on difficult cases, and writing. I've become something of a grandmother figure to the younger staff members, dispensing advice and encouragement to people who are fighting battles similar to the ones I fought. My house is full of visitors now, foundation staff, crime victims, law enforcement officers, journalists, students writing papers on elder abuse. It's the opposite of the lonely silence I knew during my years of deafness. My home has become a gathering place for people who believe in justice, who refuse to accept that crime pays, who understand that the fight for truth is never over. In the evenings, I sit in my garden and listen to the sounds of my neighborhood. Children playing, couples talking, families sharing meals together. The sounds of life continuing, of people building futures, of love persisting despite betrayal and loss. Sometimes I think about the woman I was before my hearing loss, before Thomas's death, before I learned about Kyle's crimes. She was a different person, more trusting, more naive, more willing to believe the best of people. In some ways, I miss her innocence, but I wouldn't trade places with her. The woman I am now, scarred but strong, betrayed but unbroken, older but wiser, has lived a life of purpose and meaning. She has seen justice done, families healed, criminals punished, and victims empowered. She has learned that silence is not the absence of voice, it's the presence of choice. She has learned that listening is not passive, it's active. She has learned that survival is not just about enduring, it's about thriving. Most importantly, she has learned that the human spirit is truly unbreakable. No matter how deep the betrayal, how profound the loss, how complete the devastation, we can choose to rise again.
We can choose to fight back.
We can choose to turn our pain into purpose and our silence into strength. My hearing may be fading again, but my voice has never been clearer. I speak for the victims who are afraid to speak for themselves. I speak for the families torn apart by financial crime. I speak for the elderly people who are dismissed and underestimated by those who should protect them. I speak for Frank Patterson, whose death was not in vain. I speak for Thomas, whose love gave me the strength to seek justice. I speak for every person who has been betrayed by someone they trusted, who has been told they are powerless, who has been counted out before the fight was over. This is my voice now. This is my legacy. This is her journey. And the journey continues. And that, my beautiful souls, is the power of a woman who is silenced but found her voice, betrayed but found her strength, broken but found her purpose. Martha's journey reminds us that even in our darkest moments, even when those closest to us reveal their true colors, we have the power to choose our response. We can choose to be victims, or we can choose to be survivors. We can choose to be silent, or we can choose to speak truth. We can choose to be broken, or we can choose to be unbreakable. Martha turned her greatest vulnerability into her greatest weapon. She turned her silence into a voice for thousands of people who needed to be heard. She turned her betrayal into a beacon of hope for families facing similar darkness. She proved that age is not a limitation but a liberation, that loss is not an ending but a beginning, that the human spirit, especially the spirit of a woman who refuses to give up, is truly unbreakable. If Martha's story resonated with you, if you believe in the power of truth over lies, justice over greed, and love over betrayal, then hit that subscribe button and join our Her Journey family. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it, someone who needs to know that it's never too late to fight back. It's never too late to seek justice. It's never too late to reclaim your power. Remember, beautiful souls, your silence is not weakness, it's strategy. Your listening is not passive, it's powerful. Your survival is not just endurance, it's victory. Your journey is not over, it's just beginning. Until next time, stay strong, stay true, and never forget, you are unbreakable. This is Her Journey.
This is your journey.
And it's far from over.